In 2023, Jean-Claude Van Damme sat down with the Telegraph and finally said out loud what the martial arts world had been waiting 3 decades to hear. Sony Pictures co-president Peter Guber had put $20 million on the table for each man. A live Las Vegas fight, pay-per-view, the whole spectacle. The 2 biggest action stars of the 90s, settling it once and for all. Van Damme said yes. Seagal said no. And Van Damme made sure the reporter understood something. This wasn't the first time Seagal had walked away from a direct confrontation. It was the third. The story of Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal isn't really about 2 men who hated each other. It's about 2 completely different ideas of what it means to be a martial artist, and what happens when one of those ideas turns out to be genuine and the other turns out to be a very carefully constructed illusion. At 65, Van Damme is telling the whole story, and the reason fans are still arguing about it decades after both men's peak years is simple. It was never really about the movies. Jean-Claude Camille François van Varenberg was born on the 18th of October, 1960, in Berchem-Saint-Agathe, Brussels. His father put him in Shotokan karate at age 10, not to build a fighter, but because the boy was physically slight, insecure, and needed something to push against. What came next wasn't some overnight movie-style transformation. It was something far more ordinary and far more lasting. A kid who walked into that dojo every single day, year after year, and did the work. The biggest fight was against myself, Van Damme has said more than once, and he wasn't reaching for a metaphor. That was a precise description of what it actually felt like, being the skinny kid in the room with no standout gifts except stubbornness and an unusual capacity to absorb discomfort. By his late teens, he had added kickboxing to his training, competed across Europe, and won the European Karate Championship as part of the Belgian team in 1979. He also took the Mr. Belgium bodybuilding title in 1978. None of this was dreamed up for a press kit. The competitive record existed before any camera ever pointed at him, built in official competition, in front of judges, against opponents who were fully committed to beating him. This is exactly what Van Damme meant years later when he described Seagal's hints that his credentials were somehow a matter of debate as something he found almost amusing. You don't build a competitive record across an entire continent through perception or spin. You build it by showing up and winning. He arrived in the United States in the early 1980s, carrying an accent so thick that casting directors were dismissing him before he'd finished a sentence, and a vision for his life that the city of Los Angeles had absolutely no interest in rushing to confirm. He drove taxis, he drove limousines, he delivered pizzas, he cornered producers on restaurant patios and busy sidewalks, told them his name, and asked them to remember it. Most didn't. He put flyers on car windshields and did live demonstrations on street corners, doing whatever it took to get anyone to look twice. Then one afternoon on Sunset Boulevard, he spotted Menahem Golan, the head of Canon Films, standing outside a restaurant. He threw a kick so precise and so high that Golan stopped mid-stride, reached into his pocket, and handed over a card. That card eventually led, through a long and unlikely chain of events, to Bloodsport. By any conventional measure, Bloodsport in 1988 was not a prestigious film. The story it was based on carried disputed authenticity. The shoot was cheap, Hong Kong was the backdrop, and the editing happened under serious pressure. Van Damme fought for that film, literally helped recut it when the studio considered burying it, because he genuinely believed in what it could become. When it finally opened, audiences didn't respond to the budget. They responded to him. The explosive kicks, the splits, the undeniable physical reality of a man who had spent 15 years training for exactly what the camera was capturing. It all read as something rare in the action genre. Genuine. Van Damme wasn't performing a martial artist. He was one, and even audiences who knew nothing about martial arts could feel the difference. Steven Seagal was born in 1952 in Lansing, Michigan. In his early 20s, he moved to Japan to study Aikido, training under legitimate masters for years. By his own account, he eventually became the first non-Japanese person to operate an Aikido dojo on Japanese soil. He came back to the United States as a real practitioner of a real art, with real credentials. He also had Michael Ovitz as a personal friend, which is how he went from dojo owner to Warner Brothers contract after a single choreographed demonstration. Above the Law, opened in 1988, Van Damme's path from training hall to film set had taken 8 years of delivering pizzas and doing splits on street corners. Seagal's had taken one phone call. The difference between a career built slowly from nothing and a career handed over through industry connections isn't, on its own, a moral judgment. What matters is what Seagal chose to do with that access once he had it. And what he chose to do, almost immediately, was position himself as the only legitimate martial artist in the room. In one of his earliest major interviews, he dismissed Chuck Norris, questioned the credibility of Frank Dux, whose story had directly inspired Bloodsport, and said of Van Damme's competitive record that it was, in his considered view, a matter of opinion. Not a counter-argument with specifics, not a refutation backed by evidence, just a dismissal, delivered with confidence he hadn't earned. That slow, easy smile was itself a statement. When Van Damme appeared on the Arsenio Hall show and someone brought up Seagal, he called him a wonderful guy and moved right along, which was either genuine self-control or the most efficient way possible to make another man look ridiculous without saying a word. The contrast between the two of them on screen gave their rivalry something real to chew on, something beyond two egos bumping in the dark. Van Damme came out of kickboxing, and it showed. His fight scenes were fast and high and visually electric, each kick timed to land at the exact angle the camera needed. The splits showed up at moments that felt almost theatrical in their precision. The whole thing was built on athletic ability that was plainly real and plainly earned. Seagal's Aikido was a different animal. The art itself has genuine history behind it. A system of defense built on redirecting an attacker's momentum, turning their own energy against them through joint locks and throws that barely need force when applied right. In a dojo, with partners who are cooperating, it is genuinely beautiful to watch. His early films caught that beauty well. His characters moved with a quiet, fluid economy that read as menacing in a way Van Damme's explosive technique never quite was. The problem was that one word: compliant. Fight analysts have pointed this out many times, that Aikido runs on assumptions a real fight simply does not honor. UFC commentator Joe Rogan has been blunt about it, saying Aikido would never work against a trained fighter. Never. Not in a million years. Analyst Jack Slack has written that it only functions when your opponent attacks in the straight, predictable way that any trained fighter learns to stop doing in the first week of sparring. Seagal's film fights worked because stunt performers were directed to attack in exactly the ways Aikido is built to handle. What would happen if a real opponent came at him the way real opponents actually do was a question that never got answered on screen. The Gene LeBell's story is where all of that subtext finally broke the surface. LeBell was no minor figure in any of this. He was a world judo champion, one of the people who built American submission grappling from the ground up, and a man who had spent decades working on film sets. During the production of Out for Justice, Seagal apparently told people that no submission hold could put him out. LeBell, who was on set as a stuntman at the time, offered to settle that claim on the spot. What followed has been circulating in combat sports circles for 30 years. LeBell applied a rear naked choke, and Seagal went unconscious. The secondary detail, that he lost control of his bodily functions in the process, may have grown in the telling, but LeBell has confirmed the choke itself on multiple occasions. Seagal's explanation has been that it was a backstretch that got misread, which is the kind of answer that sounds like a response without actually being one. The story has never faded, not because anyone is out to humiliate him, but because it fits perfectly with everything the evidence was already pointing toward. The early 90s were the high point for both men, and the rivalry between them was real in a way that's easy to underestimate now. Under Siege, in 1992, pulled in over $150 million worldwide, a genuine theatrical success built on a script smart enough to treat Seagal's natural stillness as an actual character quality. Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, Out for Justice, none of those were flukes. They were mainstream hits that proved a real audience existed for the cold, precise, quietly dangerous kind of action star that Seagal had essentially created. At the same time, Van Damme was delivering Universal Soldier, Time Cop, and Hard Target, that last one directed by John Woo with such total dedication to ballistic, stylized combat that it briefly positioned Van Damme as the most visually compelling martial artist Hollywood had ever put on screen. Box office returns were close. Magazine covers were split down the middle. The question of who was better, who would last longer, who actually owned the genre's future, was genuinely unresolved. And that's what gave the rivalry its weight beyond two performers chasing press attention. What finally settled it wasn't the films. It was what happened off camera, in spaces where movie choreography didn't exist to protect anyone. Sylvester Stallone, who was at the party, described the night Van Damme reached his limit with Seagal's ongoing public commentary and decided to address it directly. Not through a statement, not through a representative. In person, in front of people, as a direct and unambiguous challenge, Seagal left. Later that same night, the confrontation nearly picked back up when Van Damme followed him to a nightclub in Miami and waited outside for 2 hours. Seagal didn't come out. "If he sees me, he runs," Van Damme said years later, with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of someone describing something they had watched happen more than once. He wasn't performing outrage. He was simply recounting what he had observed across many years and 3 separate direct challenges. The man who had publicly questioned Van Damme's competitive record had, every single time a situation carried any real consequence, declined to offer a response of his own. The Sean Connery incident lives at the edges of this story, but it belongs here. In the early 1980s, before either man had a film career, Seagal was brought in as a fight choreographer on the Bond production Never Say Never Again, hired to teach Connery some Aikido basics for the role. Connery wasn't a novice. He held an honorary black belt and had trained seriously for earlier Bond films. During a rehearsal session, while Seagal was demonstrating a technique, he broke Connery's wrist. Connery brought it up on The Tonight Show in 1996, describing the incident with the careful, measured restraint of someone who had decided in advance exactly how much of what he thought he was willing to say out loud about another man. "I got a little cocky," Connery admitted, "because I thought I knew what I was doing." He never accused Seagal of misconduct directly. He didn't have to. A man who breaks the wrist of someone he's supposed to be protecting tells you everything you need to know. On set, the incidents kept coming from another angle entirely. John Leguizamo was shooting Executive Decision when he laughed at something Seagal said during rehearsal. Seagal's response was to slam him into a brick wall. "He taekwondo'd my ass," Leguizamo said, pointing out with dry accuracy that Seagal had used a technique from a discipline he didn't even study against someone who wasn't threatening him. The distance between the screen version of Seagal, a disciplined defensive artist guided by philosophy, and the man who shoved a smaller coworker into a wall for laughing, was not a gap you could paper over. Stephen Tobolowsky had a stranger experience on The Glimmer Man, where Seagal spent time between takes, arguing that his serial killer character should survive the film, having decided his screen persona needed to stop racking up body counts. The scene was shot as written anyway. Seagal then improvised lines implying his character was relieved he hadn't killed Tobolowsky's. The director had to bring Tobolowsky back in to re-record dialogue, clarifying the death had in fact happened. It was a small, absurd situation, built entirely around a man who'd fused so completely with his image that his character's moral choices felt like his own. Van Damme's mid-90s were coming apart in a completely different fashion, out in the open, with no attempt at image control. The cocaine addiction was reported. Marriages collapsed in quick succession, the kind of pattern that feeds tabloid coverage for years. The box office dried up. He didn't push back on any of it. He said he had fallen. He went through treatment and then talked about it in interviews with a directness that felt almost jarring, coming from someone who had spent 15 years selling himself as an indestructible action hero. There was no polished publicist version of events. He had fallen, and he said so out loud. Then he got back up and kept working. The clearest expression of that honesty came in 2008 with JCVD, a film where Van Damme played a version of himself, broke, behind on child support, caught inside a Belgian bank robbery. With none of the action star advantages his screen persona usually carried. Critics who'd spent 2 decades writing him off as a B-movie fighter found themselves genuinely reckoning with the performance, treating it as if it had come from a completely different actor. It hadn't. It was the same man, finally working in a setting that let what was already there become visible. Steven Seagal never made anything like that film, and never sat for anything like that interview. The image held. The mystical Aikido master, the man with ties to the intelligence world, the figure who existed beyond the reach of any real test. Every piece of it was maintained with the care of someone who knew that the image was the whole product, and that one crack would be permanent. But sealed systems don't stay sealed forever. The films drifted to direct-to-video in the late 90s and never made it back to theaters. The accusations piled up over the years: misconduct with women, violence on set, biographical details that turned out to be invented. Then came the Russian citizenship in 2016, and the role that followed as an unofficial cultural envoy for Vladimir Putin. That move recontextualized everything that had come before it. The man who had spent decades selling himself on a code of honor had become, to most of the audience that once admired him, something genuinely hard to look at. When fans run online polls today, who would have won the fight, whose career actually meant something, who really represented what the action genre was about, Van Damme pulls 90% of the vote. The people casting those votes are mostly not trained martial artists. They can't break down the technical differences between Shotokan and Aikido. What they're responding to is something simpler than technique. It's the difference between a man who showed up and a man who made sure no one could ever put him to the test. A career built on ability that was verified in competition before it ever got near a camera, versus a career built on a choreographed display for a producer who needed convincing. At 65, Van Damme talks about the physical toll of it all with the same directness he brings to everything. The joints that absorbed 40 years of competition and film work, the mornings that feel different now. He talks about the addiction. He talks about the rebuilding. He talks about the marriages. He doesn't perform calm about any of it. He reports it the same way he reported that the Sony fight offer had been turned down a 3rd time, as facts, available to anyone willing to pay attention to what actually happened. What he's telling the truth about at 65 isn't really about Steven Seagal. Seagal functions as the contrast, the mirror that shows what Van Damme is not by holding up 30 years of the alternative. What Van Damme is actually accounting for is the same thing he's been accounting for since he was 10 years old in a Brussels dojo, frail and uncertain, and walking through the door anyway. That the only version of any of this that holds up is the one that can be tested. That the image is not the thing. That 3 times is not a matter of opinion. 2 competing visions of action cinema collided in the 1990s. One was raw, physical, and willing to bleed for the camera. The other was carefully managed, endlessly delayed, and always had an excuse ready when the moment of truth arrived. The audience never needed a press release to tell them which one hit harder. Decades of ticket sales, rewatches, and loyalty have already delivered that verdict. Van Damme just finally said in public what those numbers have been quietly proving for years. That's what makes this story worth telling. The rivalry, the receipts, and the man who wasn't afraid to put his name on the answer. If you want more deep dives into the legends who built Hollywood from the ground up, subscribe and stick around. See you in the next one.